Hey guys, what's going on? Physics here once again. So in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about the current state of Melee in Path of Exile. To start, I guess for people who don't know, like my experience with Path of Exile, or people who are just, stumbling onto my channel and this is the first video you're seeing, to give a little bit of context to you guys, to understand the frame, the perspective from which I experience the game. I am a player who has played since basically 3.0 launch. I had the game introduced to me pre 3.0, but I probably put less than 10 hours into the game total before 3.0. So I really started the game in 3.0. And I'm a unique case player in which I learned the game basically entirely in hardcore solo self-found. I did play hardcore trade for a very short stint, but I don't know if I even ever made it to maps in hardcore trade before making the swap. So I am kind of a unique case that I've only ever really played hardcore solo self-found. To give you guys a little bit of an idea, I just recently passed over 8,300 hours played on the game because I do use a Steam client, so I do have the distinct advantage of knowing exactly how many hours I've logged in the game. So 8,300 hours, probably 8,290 of those being in HCSSF. So that is an important context to understand the type of Path of Exile I play, because I do think there's a large difference between all the game modes. And in terms of like my level where I tend to be at, typically I have a lot of fun pushing ladder at league starts. I would say my average for the last year is hovering somewhere around top 15 to top 30 overall on the ladder, with normally being rank 1 on the ascendancy, or if one of the top racers is playing the ascendancy, being second or third for that ascendancy. Not super important info, but just to give a little bit of context on how I like to play the game. Now, there have been times where I've done better than that, and there have been times where I've done worse than that, but that tends to be the general area of where I am around league starts. Other than that, that's kind of like after that part, I tend to focus more on fun things. I have equated myself kind of, when people ask like what I do, I equate myself kind of like a Mathel-esque like view on the game, just acclimated to hardcore SSF. I tend to just pick up weird builds and try to do like weird off-meta stuff, because I generally, as a player, tend to steer clear of things that are very meta, and generally try to skirt the line of things that tend to be strong but just not very popular. And then after the first character to the league, then I go full meme, like Bleed EQ. This footage you're seeing now is footage of a like group HCSSF private league that I run each league. And last league, I had like a little bet with Stream, because I actually got into an argument about the state of Melee with them last league in Scourge, and I did a run where I brought a Earthquake Impale Slayer up to A5 and killed A5 in 2 days. Now, that's important, like a preamble, I guess, because I was able to do that in 2 days of playtime. That doesn't mean that it felt good. That doesn't mean that it felt strong. That doesn't mean it was good or that it was strong, just because it was possible. And possible and viable are not the same thing, and I'm gonna kind of go into that now. So with that out of the way, that's who I am. That's kind of how I like to play the game. That's usually how my experience with the game fares. Okay, so I generally start with a strong build. I like to push ladder on it. After that, I tend to branch off and do more fun, interesting things, because on this YouTube channel, I make a lot of like build diaries and stuff like that, right? So constantly churning out different builds, different ideas of all different swaths of the build spectrum to just keep things interesting for the viewing experience, hopefully, right? So with that said, this topic is mostly going to be centered around hardcore solo self-found, though a decent amount of this will apply to softcore as well, but I only want to speak in the avenue of the game I play because it's what I'm most knowledgeable about. I also do believe you can make pretty much anything work pretty comfortably in a softcore trade environment, because really what Path of Exile comes down to, and I'm sure everybody has heard this a million times, but it's all about investment. like tier lists for this game are generally centered around like what differentiates an S tier build from an F tier build. Well, really, it's just the amount of time / investment it takes to hit an arbitrary point, right? That's kind of how this game works, because scaling for most things tends to be infinite outside of like ridiculous cases. But the sky's the limit, really. With infinite time and infinite resources, you can do anything on anything, which is a cool part about the game. But also, I feel, tends to lend itself to bad faith arguments when it comes to general balance in the game. Now, melee, I would say, is an overarching archetype, which I know sounds a little bit redundant, but what I mean by that is it would be like the equivalent of spells, including traps, totems, mines, brands, etc. It encompasses a very large part of the game. Now, if you would equate this to the new player experience coming in, a lot of people go, well, it's my first time playing the game. I want to do like the normal thing. I'll just the super easy. I'll make like a D2 barbarian, right, or a D3 barbarian. I'll make the warrior class. I'll just grab a two-handed sword and I'll hit stuff. That is thrown out of the window in Path of Exile. That would be incredibly bad. They would be actively hindering their experience if they were to do that, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But in terms of the new player experience, I have a plan to address some of this stuff in a later video, so I don't want to go too far into it. But the game does not make sense from that lens of like how any other game ever would function with its classes or skill design / balance, right? Which it doesn't necessarily need to. This is just leading into my next point. So my key issues with Melee and Path of Exile, that I've tried to be as unbiased as possible here. I guess a little bit of an aside, I was not a huge Melee player at all for the longest time. My first time really playing Melee was like Reeve on an Ascendant a long time ago. The death of stat sticking was like before my time. I do vaguely remember it, but I was not A, good enough at the game to even understand like what was going on with any of that, and B, I didn't play Melee back then, so it didn't really affect me, right? So like the first time that I really enjoyed a Melee build was actually, and you guys are going to call me out on being biased for this, but it was actually Impaler Call of Steel. I loved that build. It was very fun. It was very smooth to play, and I liked the mechanical ceiling there of having to line up war cries, the animation canceling, all sorts of stuff like that. If you did it and you put in the effort, you were rewarded for it, and it felt really good to play. I really liked it. And then that's kind of what started me on the whole like Melee route. Ever since then, I've only grown to enjoy Melee more and more as time has progressed. When I first started playing the game, I was kind of like, yo, why would I play Melee? Like, I see people running around with, like Reeve and stuff like that. And it's like, you have like an invisible skill and your character's just like spazzing out and nothing's happening. And then you have all these cool spells over here with fancy effects. Like, yeah, I want to play that. It looks way cooler. But like, once I actually like took the delve and started like, no pun intended. Once I actually took the delve into it and like really learned that side of the game, I've only enjoyed it more as time has gone on, which makes it kind of sad to see the current state of it. So, with that said, the key issues with Melee and PoE, I think, will be a lack of accessibility and a few keynotes. What do I mean by lack of accessibility? Well, it scales primarily with damage, not gym levels like spells. This can be very confusing and unintuitive for newer players. This is exactly what I meant when I said a few minutes ago. So, like, Melee can be very strong for leveling, but it can also be the worst experience you have while leveling. This is still a very common misconception of the game, where people think Melee sucks to level with. Even like a lot of people talking about my Earthshatter guide, they're like, man, getting this to maps felt terrible. It's not, but you need vendor recipes, you need to be on top of your base types and things like that, which I think is fine in the game, but it's just, like I said, it's very unintuitive for people who don't already have that knowledge, right? And you don't know what you don't know. So realistically, for people that, don't have a breadth of knowledge in the game, coming in and trying to do this, it's just gonna feel bad. And whether that's good or bad, that depends. I don't want to argue it. I'm just trying to present the information rather. Because there are both good and bad sides to that. Like adding depth to things is nice, but if it's at the, you have to kind of draw the line of where it's too convoluted to be worth the added depth. You know what I mean? which is a problem PoE has had in a lot of different ways for a long time. But moving on. The second thing I would say is a lack of mechanical quality of life. And what do I mean when I say that? Well, things like Melee Splash, Ancestral Call, Multi-Strike, you have to spend a lot of time. And when I say time, I mean support gyms, I mean passive points, and I mean investment in gear to fix mechanical issues with the skills themselves, which would be, I would say, would be more acceptable if the strength of them was higher. Meaning you didn't have to sacrifice your already probably relatively pathetic damage to fix mechanical issues with the skill just to make it function on a baseline. If the skill was a lot stronger to where it had like the damage necessary, it had the damage and defense necessary, where you spend most of your investment to make it smoother to play or to feel better or whatever, I think that would be more okay. But when you're faced with a skill or an entire archetype in a lot of ways, where you are pulled in so many different directions that you kind of end up having to choose what you want to get. And normally, meaningful decisions are good, but meaningful decisions at the cost of like making a build playable is not good, in my opinion. Moving on, too many pressure points for gearing / scaling. This ties into a little bit from the last point, but basically, things like spell suppression favoring heavily the right side of the tree. Left side of the tree is lacking in defense. You got a little bit of max res, but it's nothing compared to spell suppression. This leads the right side builds to sacrifice extra passive points, which can make melee struggle even more as it's already currently low DPS. And I did misspeak. I meant having to path to the right side of the tree means you have to sacrifice, 10, 15 plus passive points just to get some suppression nodes, since currently it's very, very hard to get spell suppression capped without at least taking a few passives on the tree. Things like Entrench or pathing up towards Magebane, things like that, as a duelist or a marauder, right? Very common to see. So moving on from that, what does the current ladder look like? Well, funnily enough, there's no melee skills currently in the top 10 most played skills in HCSSF. Now, this isn't necessarily an indicator of what is good and what is bad, but it is a helpful metric to measure the current meta, right? I don't like when people take PoE Ninja as gospel. Let me say that first and foremost, because it is not gospel. A lot of things on PoE Ninja tend to be popularity tests more than meta tests. The best recent example of this is Ignite, Detonate, Dead. Was slept on, strongest build in the game, by a pretty large margin, honestly. And it got completely swept under the rug. Nobody knew about it until halfway through last Gauntlet. The build existed for the entire league until that point. It just wasn't brought to light, played by top streamers, and thus exploded in popularity. And then took a 66% nerf, and was still one of the best builds in the game. Now, had you looked at PoE Ninja before month 2.5 of Scourge League, you wouldn't even know this was a build. But now, and towards the end of Scourge, it was one of the most played builds, one of the most popular. So you can't take PoE Ninja like ladder results one-to-one for what is currently the best thing. It is only a tool to help you kind of decipher what the general mindset of the player base is in terms of what is perceived as strong, right? So with that out of the way, number 11 is Bone Shatter at 2%, but the skill does struggle in multiple areas. I will delve into some of them later on in the video, but basically, Bone Shatter is really good at a few things and really bad at a few other things. It feels really good to clear with, and it feels terrible to boss with. However, I would say in the current state of the game, very, very satisfying build to just like map with and have fun. But in terms of like an all-rounder league start build, while it is possible, it doesn't feel good in my opinion, because just bossing on Bone Shatter feels terrible as someone who has played it. Now, moving on from that, you will say before you start, Spectral Helix I'm not including as a melee skill because the game does not classify it as a melee skill. Now, what do I mean when I say that? I have for the longest time thought of Spectral Helix as a melee skill because you basically have to be in effective melee range to use it. Maybe while mapping, technically not, because it will spiral out, you use Call of Steel or whatever, and then you'll hit a whole screen, right? But for bossing any type of single target, you do have to be very, very close to them to get optimal damage. So it is a very melee playstyle. However, because the game does not classify it as though, you don't get Fortify from it, which is the main defensive layer for melee builds. Which means if you want to play it, you can either do, and again, through the lens of hardcore, the most popular thing is Champion by far. You do get Fortify, you scale Impale, you get the Fledgling from Heist, and then you scale it that way. Now, you can also try to do the Deadeye build, which in my opinion is not very good in hardcore. I've been pretty vocal about that because I think the defenses are kind of gimmicky. But you can go that route as well. But that's basically the only two ways you're going to see it getting played. Simply because while Deadeye defenses are gimmicky, they can be very strong in the right situations. And then obviously Champion is just on all the time and you get Fortify from that. Now, if Spectral Helix gave Fortify and they classified it as more of a melee ability, then you could play that on Slayer and Berserker, and then its like meta would expand a lot, and Spectral Helix would be like playable in a lot more different ways, right? Which I don't know if I'm necessarily in favor of that now that we're dealing with like what, 3 leagues now. Next league would be the 4th league, which would mean like a year of Spectral Helix. So I don't think it needs that, but it is currently one of the higher played skills on the ladder, so I feel the need to address it. Next up, we have Lightning Strike. So this is interesting. Lightning Strike has a much larger effective range than Spectral Helix, but it's classified as a melee skill because it will give you Fortify. This makes literally no sense, but it is what it is. And I do want to say that while Lightning Strike is pretty highly played right now on the HESSF ladder, people are not playing Lightning Strike, they are playing Omniscience, which is not the same thing. Omniscience has so much damage that it will make anything good, realistically, have good levels of damage. And I do think that's the item and not the skill being played for the most part. Further down, we have Earth Shatter at 1%. This is mostly hyped up due to Alkaiser. As someone who has league started with Earth Shatter, every league except for this league, since Expedition 3.14, the Great Nerfening, I've league started with it every league. In Expedition and last league, yeah, Expedition and last league, I was rank 1 Zerker, again around like top 15-ish on the overall ladder, playing Earth Shatter. So I do understand Earth Shatter. I have played Earth Shatter when everyone else thought it was really bad. I have a guide on Earth Shatter Berserker. So I do understand the skill. I do think it is a good skill. I do think it is a viable skill. I think it's the best way to play slams if you want to play slams in the current day. However, it is not super strong. It is not ridiculously meta, like I've seen some people say. It is just gaining popularity because Alkaiser has been playing it. Nothing, I mean, it has gotten slightly buffed just due to general power creep in the game overall, right? But there hasn't been any like crazy buffs to it or anything ever since Expedition. It's been mostly the same. Outside of general game changes that benefited everybody across the board, it's been mostly the same, and not a whole lot has changed there. This is just people kind of like following the trend of streamers, which is, again, PoE Ninja tends to be a popularity contest more than anything else. Another good example of this is Bone Shatter having an incredibly low play rate, and then once more streamers picked it up, notably Karn, its play rate has steadily increased league over league on PoE Ninja. Now moving on, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but Fortify. I think the Fortify rework was a colossal failure. Now, you'll know, if you, like, again, this is all documented on my channel, so go watch my older videos from the start of this league and other stuff where I was not biased. With the changes, I said, we'll see how it goes. I didn't, you know, I'm not like a slam boy that's like ODing on Hopium because I just want my slams back. I have just recently started to enjoy Melee, and it makes me sad to see the current state of it in the game, right? So I wanted to see if the buff to Fortify this league would actually fix it, and it hasn't. It just straight hasn't. It was a colossal failure. It still does not work, and honestly, it's inexcusable. It's absolutely unacceptable. So this character that you see right now is my Bleed, Earthquake, and Lacerite Glad that I've been playing in the private league, like I said at the beginning of the video. Now, he has since transitioned into a pure EQ Glad because Lacerite's not playable. Why is it not playable? Well, I can't get, as a level 93 character, I cannot get 1 stack of Fortify and a tier 1 map in a Harvest. That makes 0 sense. When Harvest is some of the rippiest content in the game, that should be the one place where I always have Fortify. That being said, I also as I started to push into higher red maps on this character, I couldn't get consistent Fortify stacks with Lacerate in maps, which again is entirely unacceptable in the current state of the game. It makes no sense how that could even be a thing. And this is, you know, very relevant because I'm playing Bleed, right? The way Fortify works is it's based on how much hit damage you deal. Obviously, I'm scaling a bunch of ailment damage. My hit damage is quite low, especially on Lacerate, right? As opposed to EQ, where the hit damage is going to be a lot more because it's EQ and has a massive more multiplier on it, right? But I'm just not getting Fortify stacks in red maps, man. Like, how is this legal? This should be illegal. It's absolutely ridiculous. Fortify needs to see massive changes. It needs to see a massive overhaul because it is just not acceptable whatsoever in its current state. And to add on to that, my Ethereal Knives Inquisitor, which does a lot of Fizz to Elemental conversion and stacks a bunch of % Fizz damage, he can get Fortify in stacks. He can get Fortify in Harvest. He's a spellcaster. So the only issue with that is accuracy. But if you shield charge into a pack of 20 mobs, you're still getting Fortify. You're going to hit some of them. So the changes to make it so spellcasters couldn't abuse it, and only melee could utilize it, it just screwed over melee really, really, really hard when it already had a lot of problems. And it didn't even necessarily prevent spellcasters from abusing it. It did prevent it in most cases, yes, but not all cases. And in some cases, it can work better for a spellcaster than it can for a melee character, such as Lacerate Bleed. So what do I think realistically needs to happen? I don't have all the answers. I'm just pointing out the problem. But a random spitball idea I had was add a new keystone. People have memed about this a lot, how like Diablo just has like, you take less damage if you're melee. Straight up. If they're scared about the scalability of Fortify and that casters will abuse it, add a new keystone to the tree. It can replace Impaler, since Impaler is a dead node. If you don't think Impaler is a dead node, we play different games. Anyway, make it replace Impaler. You can put it right between Duelist and Glad or something. And it can only deal damage with melee attacks, 25% less damage taken. This would solve like most abuse cases. You wouldn't be able to obviously utilize this with totems and stuff like that, but like again, just a random spell idea, something. Because Fortify as a mechanic, they just don't seem to like it how it's currently implemented in the game, and they can't seem to get it right. I'm not against them fixing Fortify. I just don't know how they can do it. Also, if you were to add a keystone and, you know, give a blanket damage reduction buff, like, which by the way, I don't think this is the best way to do it because being shoehorned into certain parts of the tree, it feels terrible. But again, just a spitball idea. But if they were to remove Fortify, obviously they would need to compensate Champ in some way, give them a slight rework and give them a little bit more of an identity. I thought Master of Metal with the Impale stuff was really cool, but outside of that, Champ just has a lot of like, you kind of don't die, and then you rely on like very strong base skills to carry the damage of the build, which I think is fine as a concept if that's what you want to do. But if they were to take or change Fortify significantly, Champ would probably need to see changes. Now, moving on. Slams. Oh boy, slams. So slams, whether you like slams or you dislike slams, this should be something that everyone should be able to agree on if you're remotely knowledgeable on the subject. Slams lost their identity with Fist of War and Seismic Cry nerfs specifically. Now, what do I mean by that? Basically, they have anemic AoE and damage. You can effectively only play it as a Zerker and only as Earth Shatter. With that note being said, as a caveat, I did kill A5 Sirius in 2 days, 2 streams, on an EQ Slayer. It was not fun. It did not feel super good. It's possible. So this is where we get back to that argument of viable and possible being different things. Just because something is possible, just because you can do it, doesn't mean it is good, it is strong, or it is fun. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Now, the slam identity, I would say, is probably a slow windup with a big AoE and a big singular hit of damage. I think to fix this, a slight dial back of the nerfs on Fist of War to make it a support gem worth using would go a long way. What I mean when I say that rather is currently it's awful and not worth taking. Now, any build that you put Fist of War on, it is basically a damage loss. You are losing damage because they hit the damage multiplier very hard. They hit the ailment modifier even harder, and they hit the cooldown of it quite hard as well. So it's just not worth taking in almost any situation. Now, I was able to make it decent enough to take on that EQ Slayer that I took, but I had to make his attack speed so ridiculously slow for it to be a damage gain over another support gem that it felt terrible. So they need to make Fist of War good again. I just don't understand. It only works with one archetype. Like, it only works with one specific skill type, which is slams. And it's a pretty massive damage loss to use it with the only archetype it works for. Fix it. Like, come on. Like, no one ever was like, oh man, I'm so sad that I'm playing slams and I have to use Fist of War and get one hit that gives, like, it just doubles down on the entire identity of playing slams in the first place. My hit gets even bigger and does even more damage for that one massive chunk. It feels terrible that I have to use this in my slam build. No, nobody's ever said that ever. Please, just make it usable. Make it on par or slightly better than just using any other old support. Fist of War adds some, like, spice to a skill, right? It changes it in some way that is somewhat interesting. Me putting on Brutality and Melee Fizz and Pulverize, you know, these don't do anything fundamentally. It is just a more multiplier. At least Fist of War has something going for it, even from, like, a game feel standpoint, right? So it gives some of that identity back to slams. On that note, I would like to say that I think Seismic Cry should get some of its percent damage added back. Any amount is fine. I do truly think that any amount being added back to Seismic Cry is fine, because currently GGG did that thing where they just kill it but leave it in the game. They effectively delete it from the video game but leave it in the video game. They just leave its carcass there. Because if you're not familiar, currently what you have to do on any slam build you play is to replace that damage that Seismic Cry used to give you, you have to run Rallying Cry. But in order to run Rallying Cry, you have to take Herald of Purity. And this feels terrible. You have to fit a 25% aura into your build mandatory. It is 100% mandatory to run it. And it feels clunky, right? Herald of Purity minions can get you killed. They love to bait boss attacks in the wrong areas and all sorts of stuff. It's super clunky. Obviously, it limits build scope in terms of what you can do with your build because you have one aura all the time that you have to take for your build to function, right? Which GGG with, Unleash being randomly giga nerfed this league, don't like that. So they should probably have a little bit of continuity there across the board and view this in the same lens, right? Also, it doesn't have to be, I would say, in my opinion, I don't think it has to be straight up better than Rallying Cry. It just needs to give some amount of damage so you can justify running it. Even if it is a slight damage loss, you could say, well, it's not as much damage as Rallying Cry, but it does give you better clear speed with the AoE. You can be safer because you can be farther away from the boss to get the hit. But it does still give you some damage. But currently, it giving no damage destroys some of the slam identity, because one of the coolest things about Seismic Cry was that you wanted to do Warcry management, and that was fun. That was interesting. Some people didn't like it, but they probably didn't like slams if they didn't like Warcries, right? And I was one of those people for a long time when the slam rework came out. But when I sat down, learned it, I enjoyed it a lot. And I think it's missing something there, because the way it would, just like it still does work with Area of Effect, where you get more AoE based on how many previous excerpts you had, it should work the same way with the increased damage. Even if the damage is much, 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 much lower than it used to be, I still think that's fine, but it would help a lot with the feeling and the identity of the skill archetype, right? Because one other thing that I should say is the AoE on slams right now is ridiculously small. It's very obvious with the slam rework when they did it that it was 100% intended to be played in tandem with Seismic Cry. Because when you're playing these slam skills without Seismic Cry, you're way slower and you deal less damage than other stuff, and your AoE doesn't even make up for it. Everything else in the game has way more effective AoE than a slam skill does right now, which really honestly shouldn't make sense because they get it for less investment as well. I would like to add one small caveat here, also that elemental slams were never like super overbearingly strong or anything like that. And slams for the most part were only like really popular in HESSF because of how strong they were on a budget. And GGG's initial nerfs, they kept shaving stuff off the top for slams. Things like the lethal pride nerfs and stuff like that, they kept shaving off the top of the scalability, but then left like that strong baseline there. So when they hit the skill in Expedition and, you know, they nerfed everything across the board, they raised the floor even more there, and then they nerfed slams specifically, so then they raised the floor here. So it's like they hit the bottom end of the build where it was really strong on a budget, but previously they had already nerfed the top end of the build a lot, which means now there's not a ton of scalability in there because they took all of that away. But then they also made, like, they nerfed it being strong on a budget part too. So it kind of like very narrowed the scalability of slams a lot. And I would say elemental slams being included in all of these massive nerfs that were very obviously directed at like EQ and Earth Shatter was just not fair because they already weren't like super good relative to even other things, let alone just the physical version of the slams, right? So, you know what I mean? Like, how many people were realistically playing like Ice Crash and Tectonic Slam before the huge nerf, right? Not a lot of people. And then hardcore SSF, basically no one. So I don't think it's super fair to them to nuke an entire archetype for the sins of one or two skills in that archetype, which is kind of an overarching issue in PoE because they've done that with lots of things before. But yeah, I'm going to move on from this point. Now we're going to move into strike skills. This will probably be my last point, and then I'll end the video because it is starting to drag. So strike skills have been largely underwhelming, and in many cases, borderline completely unplayable for the majority of the past 4 to 5 years since stat sticking was killed. We've hit a point where dual wielding has been effectively dead for multiple expansions across multiple years, which is kind of weird to me. Now, I do remember when I first started playing this game, everyone dual wielded and two-handers were the meme. Well, not long after starting to play, they completely reversed that, right? Now, everyone's using two-handers and dual wielding is a massive meme. It's kind of mind-boggling to me that so much time has gone by and they haven't even bothered to look into it. I just want to point it out there that dual wielding should be viable in the game. It is kind of stale that, like, you use a two-hander. If you're not using a two-hander, you're always going one-handed with a shield on a melee build. And it's just, I don't know. The current state of melee in the game is just really depressing to me because there's a lot you can do with it, right? It's an entire, like, half of the game's skills and interactions are just completely underwhelming right now. And I do want to, like, reiterate, like I said at the beginning of the video, I know that a lot of these things are doable. They are playable. You can do content on them. I do it. If you look at my my YouTube channel, I've done it on tons of builds for the past how many leagues since I started uploading videos, right? I do this. I am able to do content on this. But I think really the point of view I'm starting to really come around to in this game is that things need to be fun first and foremost, right? I don't care if I can do something if I put in tons of work and tons of effort and it's just miserable the whole time. Things should be fun to play, right? And the current state of melee, I would say, overall, is not fun. At least from the lens in which I'm currently viewing the game, from a hardcore SSF player's perspective, who does enjoy melee. You know, it could be different for everyone. At the end of the day, this is just my opinion. Though I think a lot of the data would suggest that melee is in a pretty poor spot balance-wise relative to the rest of the game and should be looked at. I just want to, my last parting thought here, I guess, is if you go back and you look at my predictions for 3.17, I was positive. I was actually positive that we would be getting melee buffs or like a new archetype or something in 3.17. And we didn't get it. And it absolutely blew my mind. Again, not like a super biased point of view, but you would think, looking at the game, that would be one of the biggest things they would focus on, because it's one of the biggest overarching, again, archetypes that seems to be neglected the most, right? I will say, I've been called like a shill and like a GGG White Knight and stuff a lot for the opinions I share on the game, and typically trying to be empathetic with the way they balance the game or decisions they make, and trying to kind of just really experience it through like what I perceive to be their, you know, their eyes, how they view the game and why they make some of the decisions they do. But I do have to say that if we go into 3.18 and melee isn't at least looked at, personally, it would be a pretty big hit to my faith in the balance of the game, like their ability to balance the game. It would be a pretty big blow, because I just can't, as time goes on, like certain mechanics just being fundamentally broken, like Fortify, just for so long. This is 6 months. It's just unacceptable in my opinion. So like, honestly, if we enter 3.18 and there aren't some like substantial changes to melee and it doesn't get looked at, that would be really sad in my opinion, and I would probably just kind of like lose hope for overall balance in the game. I know a lot of you guys probably have already, because, you know, a lot of people are very vocal about they hate how GGG balances the game and takes in player feedback, but this would probably be it for me. This would be the thing that, this would be the straw for me that broke my, if I'm a camel's back, right? Anyway, enough with the you know, dramatic analogies. I think I'm gonna end the video here. There's obviously a lot more you can go into with this stuff, but I did want to get the video out. I've actually, you know, if you've seen my streams or anything, I've been wanting to make this video for literally since the beginning of this league, since I saw there were no melee changes, but I just kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And I saw the posts on Reddit today where people, you know, were complaining about the state of melee. So I guess I should stop procrastinating and finally actually record this, so I don't get called a trend follower. Hopefully you guys don't think I'm a trend follower. It's documented, I swear. I've been making this video for a long time, please. But yeah, that's gonna be everything. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Feel free to share your opinions with me down in the comments below. I read all the comments. I'm really interested to hear other people's takes, especially from people who play other facets of the game. What do you think? How do you feel about the current state of the game? What's your experience level like in the game? And, you know, do you even like melee? Things like that. Just whatever opinions you guys have, feel free to throw them down in the comments below. With that said, if you liked the video, feel free to leave me a thumbs up. If you didn't like the video, feel free to leave me a thumbs down. Tell me that my opinions are trash, or leave some constructive criticism. Feel free. I'm open to it. And then also, if you like the content that the channel, you know, is providing for you, maybe consider subscribing, because it does support me. Other than that, feel free to join the Discord where you can talk to me directly. I'm available basically anytime I'm not sleeping, helping people with their builds, talking about the game, talking about other games, you know, whatever. I'm very accessible, very available in Discord. If you just want to chat, feel free. Don't be shy. Other than that, I do still have the Merry Fizmas Private League going on. If you want to see more about that, or you're interested in maybe playing with us, there will be a link to the video where I go over all the rules and everything down in the description below. And lastly, I do stream pretty much daily on Twitch, and I will be live after this YouTube video goes up over there. So if you want to come by and talk to me based on some of the points you see in this video, or about the private league or whatever, feel free. I will be live over there. And then if you want to shoot me a follow over there or whatever to support me there as well, I'd appreciate it. But with all of the shilling out of the way, thank you guys a bunch if you made it this far in the video. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take it easy. Bye-bye.